So you want to own the Spanish Empire, galleons, treasure chests, a conquistador's breastplate, a cathedral. In 1622, the Atocha left Havana carrying 1,038 silver ingots. Everyone weighed, numbered, and entered in a register before she could move. The way a courier scans a parcel. That is the picture. The business under it was one mountain in rain. The mountain is in the Andes and it is the color of dried blood. There is no timber on it. Nothing edible grows on it. Everything that goes up it, the food, the firewood, the water, the men, is carried up by something with 4 legs, and everything that comes down is written into a book before it is allowed to leave. Every bar gets counted twice, once going onto the ship, and once by the people who want to know what the ship is worth. Potosí registered 371 million pesos of silver between 1550 and 1629. In 1626, an earth dam above the city let go and took 4 million pesos in a night. Same mountain. The second number sits inside the first. One number waits until the end. What a Potosí coin contained. In 1592, the refineries below that mountain turned out about 7.1 million ounces of silver. Best year anyone ever wrote down there. If you are the crown, you are sitting on the largest producing silver deposit in the known world. Here is what the same rain looks like from the treasury side. 1 ducat in every 4 of Castilian crown revenue was coming out of silver taxes, and the king was signing an average of 12.5 emergency short-term loan contracts a year. In some years, 38. 38 times in 12 months, somebody borrowed against silver that had not landed yet. You would expect that kind of borrowing to end badly for the lenders. It ended badly for the king. He defaulted 4 times, and the bankers who kept lending to him through all 4 walked away with a return of 20.6% across their portfolios. Meanwhile, prices inside Spain rose by something like 400% over the course of that century. Richest producer on earth, borrowing weekly. Both true at the same time in the same reign. Go back to that manifest for a second because its precision is also its edge. The sheet that sailed with the Atocha is exact down to the individual bar. Weight, tally number, shipper's mark, all of it. What that sheet cannot tell you is the one thing you would most want to know if you were running this business. How much silver was on that ship and not on the paper? There is no document for that. There never was. Every figure in the rest of this script is a declared figure, and declared is not the same as mined. So, the number being held back. In December 1642, the crown issued a decree fixing exactly what a coin struck at Potosí had to contain. Not roughly, exactly, to the part. What those coins actually contained is the last figure in this script, and it arrives at the end, because until you know it, none of the arithmetic in between is worth anything. What you are buying at Potosí is not a mountain, it is a place in the queue at the Royal Assay Office. That distinction is the whole business, so be clear about who owns what. The crown does not own the mines. Private operators do. They hold the shafts, they hire the crews, they take the losses when a gallery floods, and if they strike a rich seam, the silver is theirs. What the crown owns is the door. Silver cannot become money by being dug up. It has to be brought down to the royal house, melted, poured into bars of 60 to 80 pounds, assayed, stamped, and taxed at a fifth before a single coin can legally exist. 20% off the top of everything that passes through. And that rate does not move. Not through the boom, not through the crash, not through 4 royal defaults. The quinto at Potosí is still a fifth in 1736, when the crown finally halves it to a tenth. Nearly 2 centuries at the same number. Run the traffic through that door and you can see the size of it. In the 80 years to 1629, it passed 371 million pesos of registered silver. The nearest thing to it anywhere in the empire is Zacatecas in New Spain, at 90 million. Not a close second, a different order of thing. Now here is the part that catches people out about a tax like that. You would assume the fifth is what makes the crown its money, and that the crown's job is simply to sit at the door and count. It is not, and the proof is in what the crown sells rather than what it takes. Nothing physically forces an operator through that assay house. What forces him is that every single input he needs to turn rock into silver is sold to him by the same government that taxes the output. Viceroy Toledo said it out loud in 1571, the year refiners finally got Huancavelica Mercury to work on Potosí ore. He called the union of those 2 mines the greatest marriage in the world. He was not being poetic. He was describing a supply chain he held at both ends. And it worked. By 1594, treasure made up 95.62% of the value coming home from the Indies, about a quarter of that on the crown's own account. Everything else in the hold, the indigo, the tobacco, the hides, rounds to nothing. Toledo did one other thing in those years, and it is the thing that will decide whether you make money or not. He wrote the mine owners a labor force. By decree, hold that. Everything from here is priced in pesos, and one currency only, because mixing them is how people end up believing things about this empire that are not true. Start with the altitude, because the altitude sets every other price. Potosí sits at 4,782 meters. That is higher than almost anywhere people have ever chosen to live in numbers. Water boils cool. Mortar cures badly. A man carrying a load stops more often than he would 3,000 meters lower, and there is nothing you can do about that with money. Then the supply lines. Coca came up from Cusco 600 miles away in packed trains of 500 llamas moving at the pace of a walking animal for weeks. On the hard routes, a single basket of it sold for more than 30 pesos of assayed silver. 30 pesos. For a basket of leaves, because the crews chewed it through 12-hour shifts, and without it the shifts did not happen. And then the part that actually decides the business, Mercury. You cannot get silver out of Potosí ore by roasting it. You get it out by amalgamation. And amalgamation eats mercury. Roughly 1.7 pounds of mercury for every pound of silver you recover. That figure is a working average, and I want to be honest that the sources give it as a range, anywhere from 1-to-1 up to 2-to-1, depending on how rich the ore was and how good your refiner was. The direction never changes, though. To make silver, you burn away more than its own weight in something else, and there is exactly one place you can legally buy that something else. Huancavelica. A crown mine. At its peak in the late 150s, it worked over 3,000 forced laborers to produce upward of 6,000 quintals of mercury a year, around 138,000 kilograms, and every ounce of it was the government's to price. So here is the assumption worth putting down. You would think a silver mine's biggest problem is getting the silver out of the ground. It is not. What you are buying, before you own a single vein, is a water mill with a chemical plant bolted onto it, standing at the height of a light aircraft, where the water, the fuel, the food, and the one chemical that makes the whole thing work all have to be carried in over mountains. And the chemical has one seller. Now put the recurring lines in order, the way an operator would have to, and add them up out loud. Line 1 is the fifth, and it is already spoken for before you begin. Not a one-off payment, not a fee on the good years. A fifth of every bar you ever pour for as long as you pour bars. Line 2 is mercury, and it scales with your output rather than with your ambition. Run it at the ratio, and you are buying about 1.7 tons of mercury per ton of silver you bring in. Double your production, and you double that bill. There is no volume discount because there is no second supplier. Line 3 is the ride home. The Avaria, the levy that paid for the warships escorting the convoys, and this one has a direction. It sat somewhere around 2% of declared cargo in the 16th century and climbed to somewhere around 12 in the 17th. I want to flag that honestly. That is a range across 100 years, not a rate you could have quoted for any particular sailing. The rate moved with the war, but it moved one way. Line 4 is labor, it is variable, and it is the heaviest of the four. In 1573, Viceroy Toledo created the mita, a draft. By 1578, it stood at over 14,000 men a year, pulled out of 16 highland provinces. That is 1 in 7 of every adult male in those provinces gone. Not once, every year, rolling, and Toledo scheduled it. In 1575, he cut the draft into 3 parts, 2 resting while 1 worked, and assigned 3,615 men to the mine owners and refineries every single week. A rota, written in a palace in Lima, for a mountain most of the men in it had never seen, listing how many bodies would arrive at your refinery on Monday. So count what is fixed before a sack of ore leaves the hill. A fifth of your output to the assay office. A mercury bill that rises exactly in step with your production, from a supplier you cannot leave. A convoy levy that only ever went up, and a labor rota you did not write and cannot amend. 4 cost lines and you set none of them. Not the rate, not the price, not the supplier, not the head count, not the week it arrives. You have not hired anybody yet. You have not broken ground. You have not bought a mule. You have not sold an ounce. And 4 of the numbers in your books are already filled in ink, by people who will never see it. Here is where the arithmetic turns on the person doing it. A drafted man's job at Potosí was to get ore out of the workings. That meant going down on notched log ladders into the dark, filling a sack, and coming back up with 45 kilograms on his back. Then again, the reason the draft existed at all is that this was the work nobody would take at the wage the draft paid. So on paper, the mine owner has been handed something extraordinary. A workforce that turns up whether or not the price is right, priced below what the market would ever have cleared. 14,000 men a year scheduled, delivered to his door. And it is the reason he goes under. Look at what Potosí actually looked like from the inside. A description of the city written in 1603 counts the indigenous workforce and comes out at 5,100 draftees, 10,500 contract men, and 43,200 people working for a straight wage. Read those three numbers again against the rota. The system was supposed to be putting 14,000 conscripts a year into that city. The count found 5,100. The draft was not delivering what the paper said it would. I am not going to guess at the reasons, because the count is what survives and the explanation is not. What survives is the gap. The tonnage still had to move. So the operator went out and bought the difference on the open market, and this is the mechanism that turns a subsidy into a trap. A hired man was paid up to 5 times what a draftee got for the identical work, on the identical ladders. The honest version of that figure is that the sources disagree on the multiple. Another study puts it nearer 3, but nobody puts it at 1, and the men filling those hired shifts were frequently the same men. A draftee on his rest week could hire himself out as a contract worker at the free rate, in the same shaft he had been marched into a fortnight earlier. So follow the money per man. You pay the crown system for a conscript. The conscript alone cannot move your ore. You then pay the open market at up to 5 times the rate to buy back the labor the state has just taken out of the same villages. Per man, the subsidized worker is the most expensive one on the mountain. Now run it. 1 currency, pesos, 1 mountain, and no conversions to modern money. That conversion is meaningless across 400 years, and it hides more than it shows. Compare inside the period instead. Before Mercury, Potosí was dying. Registered output across the 5 years from 1565 to 1569 came to 10 million pesos. Across the next 5, from 1570 to 1574, it came to 6.4 million. Divide those out. 2 million pesos a year, falling to 1.28 million pesos a year. Output down by a third in a decade, on a mountain. Everybody had already decided was the richest thing in the world. That is the state of the business when the refiners crack amalgamation in 1571. Now the 150/70s as a whole, 47 million pesos. Across 10 years, an average of 4.7 million a year. Then the 158s, 64 million pesos, an average of 6.4 million a year. Watch the step between those 2 decades on its own. 47 million pesos, then 64 million. 17 million pesos of additional registered silver. Decade on decade, from a mountain that had been in production for a generation already and had just been written off. Set the trough against the peak. 1.28 million a year, then 6.4 million a year. 5 times inside 15 years out of the same rock, dug by roughly the same men with roughly the same tools. Nothing was discovered. Nobody found a new seam. A chemical process was fixed, and a mine that was closing became the largest single source of money on the planet. Now take the crown's cut of that. A fifth of 6.4 million pesos is 1.28 million pesos a year. Notice what that figure is. It is the same number as the mountain's entire annual output in the years just before amalgamation. By the 158s, the tax alone equaled what the whole operation had been producing 15 years earlier. That is not a rounding coincidence I am dressing up. Those are 2 separate columns in 2 separate records that happen to land on the same figure. And there is a third record. The treasury books show the 5th coming out of Potosí running at over 1 million pesos a year from 1579 to 1634. 2 independent documents, one calculated and one recorded, agreeing. One cost line is deliberately not in this arithmetic, and it should be named rather than guessed at. The operator's own mercury and wages. The record carries those as ratios, not as peso figures. 1.7 pounds of mercury per pound of silver, and a hired wage up to 5 times a draftee's. Those give you the shape of the lines. They do not give you their value in pesos, and putting a peso figure on them would be inventing one. So they stay out of the sum, and they stay named. 2 years, 2 disasters with names on them, and neither is the one the operator was paying to be protected from. Start with the water, because the mills needed power and the mountain had none. So the city built it. Officials put nearly 10,000 drafted Andean workers, and a larger number of llamas than that, onto raising dams and cutting canals in the Karikir Range on the slopes above town. Earth walls, holding back artificial lakes, sitting directly uphill of every refinery in Potosí and every street the refinery workers lived on. In March of 1626, one of them gave way. 350 known dead, and many more simply missing. Damage put at some 4 million silver pesos in a city of around 120,000 people. Put that next to the crown's income from the same mountain. The fifth was clearing over 1 million pesos a year in exactly those decades. So a single earth dam, in a single night, destroyed something on the order of 4 years of everything the crown lifted off Potosí. Not 4 years of profit. 4 years of the tax. Now the other one, and here is where the expectation goes wrong. If you were an investor in this system, the risk you insured against, argued about, and paid a levy for was enemy ships, corsairs, privateers, the English, the Dutch. That risk was real. In September 1628, Pete Haynes' Dutch West India Company squadron caught the homebound treasure fleet in the Bay of Matanzas and took it without firing a shot. 11,509,524 guilders of gold, silver, indigo, and cochineal, changing owner in an afternoon. That figure is Dutch, in guilders, and it does not belong in the peso column. I am not going to pretend those two currencies can be added. That is what the counting was for. Every bar in that fleet had been weighed and registered so the crown could take its fifth and the merchants could pay the escort. All of it walked, in one piece, into somebody else's harbor. And 6 years before that, the Atocha had already shown the other way it ends. She went down in a storm carrying 1,038 registered bars, with 265 people aboard. 5 came out alive, the register survived, and the silver did not. So look at what the levy did in response. The Avaria climbed from around 2% to around 12%. The escort was the one cost the crown could still raise, so it raised it. And it was buying protection against the smaller of the two risks. Set a good year against a bad one. Same mountain, 15 years apart, and read the 2 columns straight down. The good year is 1,611. Population, about 160,000. And the breakdown is worth hearing because it tells you what kind of place a mine builds. 76,000 Indians, 40,000 Europeans who were not Spanish, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, English, 35,000 Creoles, 6,000 Africans, and 3,000 Spaniards. 3,000. In the city the whole empire was built on, the Spaniards are the smallest column in the census. Royal fifth, clearing over 1 million pesos a year. Registered silver. Running. The count that started in 1,550 will stand at 371 million pesos by 1,629, and 1 peso in 5 of that figure was the crown's before anybody else was paid. That is the good column. Now the bad one. The bad year is 1,626. Dam gone. 350 known dead. 4 million pesos of damage. Population down to about 120,000. Say the spread out loud, because that is what you are actually buying into. 40,000 fewer people in the city, and 4 million pesos wiped off it, inside 15 years. Not a bad quarter. A city with a third of it gone. Now widen the frame, because the same shape holds for the whole empire. Registered bullion arriving in Spain between 1,500 and 1,650. 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver. That is the number people mean when they talk about Spanish treasure, and it is a real number, taken off real customs registers at Seville. Here is the part almost nobody expects. A great deal of the metal never went to Spain at all. About 75 metric tons of silver a year went the other way, west, out of Acapulco, across the Pacific to Manila, and from Manila into China. Not smuggled, sailed on a schedule. Hold that against the Seville figure for a second, carefully, because the two periods are not identical, and I do not want to overstate it. 16,000 tons of silver, spread across 150 years, averages out at something in the order of 107 tons a year landing in Spain. The westbound run across the Pacific was making about 75. Same metal, same decades for most of that stretch, and one flow is roughly 2/3 the size of the other, except only one of them ever passed a Spanish customs house. And the reason is a price gap that sat there for decades. Silver bought gold at a ratio of about 1 to 6 in China, against about 1 to 12 in Europe. The same bar of silver was worth roughly twice as much in Canton as it was in Seville. So a merchant in Acapulco holding Potosí silver had two customers, an empire that would tax him at a fifth, and a market on the other side of an ocean that would pay him double. A lot of them picked the market. The empire had built a machine that counted every ingot out of the mountain, and then watched a large share of the output sail out of the back door on a westbound wind. Here it is, the number that has been waiting since the first minute of this. In December 1642, the Crown issued a decree setting the standard for coins struck at Potosí, 93 parts silver in every 100, precise, legally binding, and enforced by an assayer whose mark went onto the metal. Complaints came in anyway. Merchants had been muttering for years that Potosí money did not weigh right. At the end of 1648, investigators finally opened the mint's books. The coins held about 75% of the silver they were supposed to contain. An 8-real piece, a piece of 8, the coin that half the planet was using to settle accounts with the other half, was worth as little as 5 reals. Not a shaved edge, not a few bad batches. The mint at the center of the world's silver supply had been striking money that was 3/4 of what it said on the face. What follows is the part that tells you how bad it was. In October 1650, the Crown ordered its own money devalued. In January 1652, the Viceroy's decree came down. The debased 8-real pieces were cut to 6 reals, and even the newly struck 8-real coins were only allowed to pass at 7.5. Francisco Gómez de la Rocha, the mint's silver merchant, and Juan Ramírez de Arellano, its assayer, were executed. Now set that beside the one number in this whole story that never moved, a fifth, 20% of every bar, from the first strike to 1736. The Spanish crown could hold a tax rate steady for the better part of 2 centuries. It could not hold the silver content of its own coin steady for 10 years, which is the whole thing, said plainly. The crown never owned the mountain. It owned the door, the assay office that stamped the bars, the Mercury mine that made refining possible, the register that assigned the men, the warships that took the cargo home, and it charged at every one of them. That was the business, and it was a very good business. What it could not do was guarantee that the coin coming out the far side held the metal stamped on its face. It sold licenses, labor, and passage brilliantly. The one product with its name on it, it could not keep honest. Go back to where this started. A galleon leaving Havana in 1622, and 1,038 silver bars in her hold, each one weighed, numbered, and entered in a register before she was allowed to move. That register was so exact that when divers found the wreck 3.5 centuries later, they matched bars to it by the tally numbers. An empire that counted every single ingot out of a mountain and could not tell you what its own money was worth. What you are looking at is not a treasure fleet. It is an accounting department with a navy.